Let me introduce you to Sally Flock. She's the president and CEO of PETS, an advocacy organization dedicated to Metro Atlanta safe and accessible for all pedestrians. Let me tell you that Sally founded PETS in 1996 after a brain surgery that enabled her to control a seizure disorder and prevented her from driving. So that was the main motivation to start PETS. And with this presentation, she will be discussing everything that she has been doing so far, and especially she's going to pose, the need for increasing investment in sidewalk maintenance in the city of Atlanta. Let me also tell you something. Doug Allen was once our dean, I think, 2 years ago. He's a very good friend of Sally, and he sent an email apologizing that he couldn't make it here today, but he gave me some more information about Sally that I didn't know, and I'd like to share with you. So it says, Sally served previously on the board of directors of American Walks and on the steering committees of the Complete Streets and the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. So Sally also taught briefly at Georgia Tech in history. She holds a PhD in American history from Yale, and her dissertation was on the origins of the New South, late 19th century American South, and it was directed by Van Woodward, considered by many to be the major figure of the 20th century in the subject.
Okay.
So very impressive.
He's got a good memory.
Yes. So, welcome, Sally. I'm looking forward to the presentation, and yes.
Okay, great. I taught history here for about 3 years, but I got to say, Georgia Tech students were not particularly interested in history. But it gave me great preparation for what I do now, because I continue to teach engineers about subjects they're not particularly interested in. Okay, I'm going to be talking really about 3 subjects today. Let's see, okay. One is the need for more maintenance, but also we'll be talking about the need for safer crossings at transit stops, and just what is good sidewalk design, because here in Midtown Atlanta, I'm seeing a lot of bad sidewalk design, and especially bad sidewalk design from the perspective of older pedestrians. So we'll be getting into all of those issues. This is actually a little outdated. We are now the 11th most dangerous place for pedestrians, which is not much better. But yesterday, there was in the New York Times front page story about Florida. On their wide roads, pedestrians are really running for their life to cross the street. Atlanta is the same problem. Wide roads with no safe crossings, and very dangerous to cross the street for everybody, not just seniors. But if young people who are really healthy, who are runners, are losing their lives crossing the street, you can imagine how difficult it will be for older adults to get across these streets that have no pedestrian facilities for crossing. The Atlanta Regional Commission did research last year, really at our request, we asked what percentage of the pedestrian crashes are really related to transit or occurring close to transit, and we found that 25% of all the crashes in the region are happening within 100 feet of a bus stop or a transit station. 48% are occurring within 300 feet of a station, and that's telling us a lot about an area that needs more work. There's never been any follow-up in the sense of what are we going to do to address this problem? What money are we investing? I was very disappointed with the project list that the Atlanta Regional Commission came up with, because there is nothing in it to address pedestrian safety from a regional perspective. Jane Hayes, the transportation director, said to me, well, you can use local money for the transportation. There's this attitude that walking is all local. But if I live in Midtown, if I need to go out to Cobb County and cross the street, I've got 2 choices. Walk 10 minutes out of my way to get to a crosswalk, or put my life in my hands and risk being charged with reckless conduct if I cross the street in a reasonable way. And as you know, Atlanta is hot, and so you don't really want to walk 10 minutes out of your way just to cross the street. The Atlanta Regional Commission also did great research on who is using transit. It's often low-income people who don't have access to a car, or other people like myself who, because of epilepsy, cannot drive. A lot of older people who need to give up driving, although they're actually, most of them are not using our fixed route transit system. Most of the people who are using transit are walking to transit. 72% are walking. Some of them are walking, other people are walking part of the way. And anybody who's walking to transit is going to have to cross a street at least once to make a round trip. What's really of concern to me is only 2% of the trips are by people 65 or older. I think most of the seniors who use transit are using paratransit, which is very expensive, needs to be heavily subsidized, and is very limited in how often you can go, or you have to schedule it days in advance. But it's a system that I don't think is sustainable. If the baby boomers are retiring and only relying on paratransit, I don't think this region will be able to afford it. And it was really articles like this that got us to ask the Atlanta Regional Commission to research the relationship between transit and pedestrian crashes. We were seeing articles over and over about crashes where people had just gotten off a bus, too far to walk to a crosswalk, and then they get killed crossing the street. And in Cobb County, it's especially disturbing because not only are people losing their lives, but then the mothers are often being charged either with vehicular homicide or manslaughter. This is what the conventional wisdom is on pedestrian safety: use crosswalks. But the problem is there are no crosswalks within a walking distance that is reasonable. The speeds are very high, so walking long distances alongside these roads, and most people are going 15 miles over the limit, is also very dangerous. Our infrastructure near transit for pedestrians is pathetic. You've got these bus shelters, no sidewalks, no crossing facilities. And you can see in that lower photo, even walking along the dirt path there would be impossible. There's so much vegetation there. And people want to get across the street safely. They're not being reckless. They're making choices of which is my best way. I've watched people on Buford Highway, our most dangerous road. They are doing their best to watch out and find safe gaps in traffic. But when you don't even have a median, it's very hard to find a safe gap in both directions. This is a blog that I wrote recently that was published on the public broadcasting station's website about how it's not the victim who is at fault when people are getting killed. It's usually the design of our roads. Speed width makes a huge difference. Once you get up to 4 lanes, the risk of a pedestrian crash with a vehicle just rises exponentially. Other things that matter are speed. If you get hit at 20 miles an hour, it's only a 5% chance of death for the pedestrian. If you get hit at 30, it's a 45% chance of death. And if you get hit at 40, it's an 85% chance of death. I think here at Tech, people know that impact matters. And so our roads are too fast for having multimodal traffic. They're designed like airport runways, and if you design a road like that, that's how people are going to drive. Lighting matters. A lot of the pedestrian crashes are happening at night, and it is hard to see people. As a driver, I have driven some. During certain periods of my life, I have been able to drive, and I do know out in Buford Highway it is hard to see people in enough time to be able to avoid them. And so there again, it's not necessarily the driver that's to blame then, it is the lack of lighting on these roads. The US DOT is saying that pedestrians have a right to cross safely, and our engineers have a responsibility to plan and design for us, but we don't see that happening. When, after Raquel Nelson's trial brought a lot of attention, very negative attention to our region. She's the mother who was charged with vehicular homicide, actually convicted last month, brought a lot of attention, and there was a petition with over 150,000 signatures asking the Cobb County to put in a crosswalk. Well, this was a state road, and they've already gone on TV in an interview and said, no, we will not. And I've written back to them to say, well, obviously you don't put in just a crosswalk, but there are plenty of things you can do here. But they have a very closed mind about mid-block crossings. Last year, the U.S. Secretary of Transportation has charged the state DOTs with treating pedestrians and cyclists as equal with other modes. We don't see that happening. Having the safe crossing facilities matter a lot. This is a guidebook by the Federal Highway Administration on the safety effects of marked versus unmarked crossings. It's had a huge impact on how the Georgia DOT has treated pedestrians, but in a very negative way. What it said is that on a multi-lane road with 4 lanes or more and traffic going, I think 35 or higher, it's actually more dangerous to have a marked crosswalk on its own than to have nothing. So let's take a road like Ponce de Leon or even West Peachtree at 4th Street. That marked crosswalk at 4th Street and West Peachtree is more dangerous than nothing. But that doesn't mean do nothing. But that is how the Georgia DOT has interpreted this book. When they are resurfacing streets, they remove all the crosswalks at locations that don't have signals. You have a question?
Why is it more dangerous than nothing?
Well, the theory is that one driver will stop, and then it creates a visual shield. And the pedestrian is expecting, since they're in a crosswalk, that they've got the right of way, and probably they're keeping going. Other drivers are going too fast, not paying attention, and they can't see, and the pedestrian can't see beyond that car. Drivers here are stopping way too close to the crosswalk also. But what this book was saying is do more. Put in lighting, put in signage, put in other signals, put in medians. There are plenty of things that can be done, but the DOT just took this black and white attitude. If it's controlled by a stop sign or a signal, okay, we'll put in a crosswalk. If it's not controlled by a signal or a stop sign, we're going to do nothing. And we have been fighting that since 2006. It was interesting, the DOT organized a training workshop for transportation professionals, their own people and people with City of Atlanta and other jurisdictions, about Ponce de Leon. This is right near a high-rise that serves older people, and people had been killed in this crosswalk. We all agreed that the thing to do was to convert one of the lanes on Ponce to a 2-way center turn lane and put in refuge islands. And an engineer with DOT who didn't attend the workshop, within a month removed the crosswalk and put up a sign that says, use the crosswalk. As you can see, people don't respect signs like that. They're actually violating the Americans with Disabilities Act because somebody who's visually impaired would have no idea that that crosswalk is removed. That the transportation engineers are required to make a cane detectable barrier if they put in a sign like that, but it is not happening. And here's what the spokesperson for DOT says. The real issue is about getting the pedestrians to cross at a safe location that's controlled. We don't think that's really true because there are no traffic signals within a walking distance. And the reality is traffic signals, they have guidelines or what they call warrants, where you would have to have 93 pedestrians an hour to warrant a signal. They know that they're not going to be putting in signals. And so what they are telling people is totally just, it's a sham, basically. It's something you can tell the media, but they know they're not going to be putting that stuff in, and they know that there are areas where there's a full mile between signals. But there's a lot of other things that can be done. You can narrow a road, do other traffic calming that slows things down. Some of the things I just mentioned about the raised islands or lighting. And there are new kinds of beacons that are very promising. Just a median, which is the cheapest thing, one of the cheapest things you can do, makes a huge difference. If you have them in a marked crosswalk, it will reduce the the risk of crashes by 46% because you're dealing with one direction of traffic at a time. Probably the most dangerous lane for a pedestrian to be in is as they're approaching that double yellow line, and they're having to watch the traffic in their direction on their half of the road and also pay attention on that second half. But if you have a place to wait where you're protected by the raised island, it becomes a lot safer. That also helps seniors a lot because if they're slower, then let's say there is a signal there and they can see, especially at a countdown signal, ooh, there's only 3 seconds left. They can wait there and use the next cycle. And even in a place that doesn't have a crosswalk, putting in these islands will make a big difference because even on a high-speed road like Buford Highway, dealing with 3 lanes at a time instead of all 7 and not having to worry about the cars turning into the two-way center turn lane is going to make it a lot safer. Other states, Florida, I know, Oregon, that was one of the first things they did on their suburban arterials is they went in and put medians or median islands everywhere. It's just basic, you know, break it up. Here's an example of a Cobb County bus stop. Put in an island, it's going to be a lot safer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you have an area where a person with disabilities could cross?
Well, what I would do is put a cut through on that. You could definitely do that. I think it's going to be harder to convince the DOT to do that because they're going to say, oh, we don't want to give people the sense it's a crossing.
The other reason is with our work we've done at Marion High Rise,
Mm-hmm.
older adults in Sidney Marcus, is that even for them to have to get up there with a walker, or,
Mm-hmm.
or not even a walker, say they just fall
Right.
uncomfortable of falling. That,
No, I think a cut through on that would definitely, yeah, I definitely.
that's the convincing we have to do with DOT.
We do, and one of the ones I showed earlier that was by the Freedom Park Trail, it had the cut through, and I definitely would recommend that. We just weren't that skilled with doing Photoshop.
Good job.
And it's easy to figure out.
Yeah.
What we've noticed on Buford Highway is that some people don't go all the way to the hawk signals that have been put in, but they're taking advantage of the safety effect of that median island. It's very simple to figure out. This is the hawk signal. This is actually Buford Highway. I never thought people crossing Buford Highway would look as peaceful as an Abbey Road. But it reminds me of that. And you can see they're not running. It is a much safer crossing. The hawk signal is interesting. It's blacked out for motorists except when people have pushed the button. When people push the button to cross, it will go to a flashing yellow, and then a solid yellow, then a solid red. And then those 2 red lights are going to flash back and forth. Once it's doing that, the driver can go if the pedestrian is out of the road. Most drivers haven't figured that out, but I figure better to stop a little longer than not to have them stop at all. And the main reason they came up with that is to get around the warrants in the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It was invented out in Tucson, Arizona, and it requires just 20 pedestrians per peak hour, and you're much more likely to meet that than you are to get 93 pedestrians. Or I think the other thing you can have is if you have 5 pedestrian deaths in 1 year, which hopefully we will never have either at any transit stop. But this is going to be, I think, the way our region is going on a lot of these high-speed roads because people understand that red means stop. This is another one that's less expensive. Because they look like police strobe lights, people are stopping for them. They've been used in a pilot project in Florida, and I think the compliance rate went from 20% to 80%. The city, or the state and the city of Atlanta have both sought and received permission from the Federal Highway Administration to start using these. They've led a project for right by the Midtown MARTA station, I think by the Civic Center MARTA station, so we expect to start seeing these. I think they will work on roads with speed limits of 35 or less. I'm a little wary about whether they would work on roads with 40 or higher. You can also do a lot of stuff. You don't have the idea in that Federal Highway Administration research publication was, if one thing isn't enough, keep adding on until you've made it work that people have a safe crossing. And this is actually the location where Raquel Nelson's son was killed. You can see a left turn lane had been added to this street. I don't know if it went in originally, it was the original design. But at the area where the lines are, you can see that there's a left turn lane. The bus stop is located near that, where the median, because of the left turn lane, the median is just 3 feet wide. Here's a mother standing with 3 children and other transit users on a 3-foot wide median next to traffic that's going 60 miles an hour. They crossed, the child was hit. That's a little bit off. He was actually hit in the final lane closest to the crosswalk. But just moving the bus stop back 140 feet, and they would have had a 16-foot wide median to stand on, and there would have been just 2 lanes in the final half of the crossing instead of 3. In my opinion, that's one of the biggest factors in why that child was killed, is the mother called out to her child, stop. On a 16-foot wide median, he probably would have. After she yelled that, she realized that could make things worse, and she went running after him. And he was killed in the final lane, which by that time he would have been on the sidewalk, the distance he would have traveled. So what did Cobb County do after the crash? Within about a month, they had put up a poster telling people to use crosswalks. Well, the problem is the crosswalk is 3/10 of a mile away. Walking with 3 young children 3/10 of a mile adjacent to 60-mile-an-hour traffic is not safe. Crossing in a signalized intersection with 3 children, many of whom they're going to face motorists who are turning left, that's not so safe either. And so one of the questions I have for everybody is, what's the best means of getting the DOT to agree to put in crossings? I'm thinking talking to Doug Stoner, who represents that area in the state legislature, and getting him and maybe somebody from the Transportation Board out there and actually making them cross the street would help. Another idea is to write to the U.S. Secretary of Transportation and the Federal Highway Administration Office of Civil Rights and see if they will intervene, telling that DOT they're not treating pedestrians as equals, or just getting seniors out there with picket signs. Maybe people with walkers, and getting the media out there, showing how hard it would be for somebody with a walker, or with a cane, to walk 3/10 of a mile, or maybe blindfold the DOT engineer and make them try it. Yeah.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah, sure. I think. Whoops, I'm doing this wrong.
Why do you think this was their solution instead of moving the bus stop? Can you give us a scale why it's so difficult to move the bus stop, as you suggested, instead of just simply investing in printing out these posters?
Well, one reason would be fear of a lawsuit, that it would be almost an admission that they were partly to blame. Transportation engineers are always talking about liability, and if they've done something that contributed to a crash, they could be sued. And I think they might be willing to move it after the statute of limitations has gone. I mean, that sounds pretty cynical about government, but after working on this for 15 years, you get that way a little bit. Yeah?
Since it's a bus stop, what role or responsibility does MARTA have?
Well, this is actually Cobb Community Transit. And so the most dangerous roads are in our inner suburbs. After a lot of the housing projects, or as housing projects in the city were torn down, a lot of lower income people moved out to the suburbs. And so there are apartment buildings on roads that were designed for cars only. But there are roads in city of Atlanta also, Roswell Road. There's an area there where there is a full mile stretch with no pedestrian crossings. What one of the things we're planning to do is to get a task team together with representatives of all the transit agencies and the Georgia DOT and local transportation departments, and come up with guidelines on bus stop location. What we see out in Cobb especially is that the bus stops seem to be randomly located.
Again, coming back to my previous questions in
Yeah.
terms of the scale of making that change of moving the stop, what does it mean to just move a bus stop from point A to point B?
Well, it would be, I think in terms of the threat of being found liable, I think if they were to be sued, it would be like saying, yeah, we agree that was a bad location. And some people have said that the reason they even prosecuted Raquel Nelson was a way to make it harder for her to sue. She had no intent to sue, but that is what some people have said, because the biggest question about that trial is, why did they even go after her? That it's up to the prosecutor to decide which cases to take and which not to. And in that case, you know, she's been punished so badly already by losing her child, and you know, they're delusional if they think it's going to deter other people from crossing there. And so some people do think that their reason for going after her was to make it harder.
Okay, let me put my question in another way. So let us suppose there was no crash accident in that stop, but you're an expert and you realize that, you know what, in order to prevent accidents, we should move this bus stop from point A to point B. It would make things way better that way. How difficult is to get the city to do that change of moving the bus stop from point A to point B? I'm just trying to understand, what does it mean to make a change like that in a city?
We have found trying to get MARTA to move these things is difficult. There's one, and you'll see it in a picture a little later, where on Peachtree near 17th, that takes up most of the sidewalk. It's not in the furniture zone, and it also creates problems with sight distance for turning drivers. And we've tried to get them to move it, and it's very difficult. They have private companies putting in these shelters. They tend to put them in where the most drivers will see their advertising. It's not necessarily where they're most needed. I don't know if they're the ones who decide where to put the bus stops in, but they're certainly the ones who decide which ones get shelters. Yeah, Carol?
I think we've been working with MARTA on some of these issues, and Mark and Tolliver, they've been fairly receptive to they have to give it priority. They look at the issues and the safety of the crossing. There's one in the northwest area of Atlanta that was on a curve where older adults were trying to cross. They also have to look at the landing space on a curve, on a sidewalk. This seems to fit the bill fine, but some areas don't have any space for someone to safely get off in a wheelchair, for example.
Okay.
So there are some things they have to look at, but we can still, I think with, like I said, we're using the aging numbers as you're going to have to start. This is no longer just people who don't have a car or decide to walk, and they're just kind of odd ducks in this region. It's going to be a lot more people, and they're going to start demanding that this is improved. So, and we just can't have any more deaths like this.
Well, and I think also that they will be concerned about the alternative, which would be increasing paratransit costs, and that will motivate them to do more. Yeah.
I'm just curious. I was kind of thinking in my head about places where I go a lot, and on Monroe, between Potts and like Piedmont, there appears to be like a crosswalk about every couple of blocks.
Right.
And when I go down Cherokee through Grant Park, there are crosswalks about every 2 blocks, which seems a little much to me. But I'm just curious if there's been any data or research about the number and frequency of crosswalks in different parts of the community.
I think what you're talking about is marked crosswalks, because The state code actually defines a crosswalk as the lateral lines between the sidewalks on either side of the street. So even if they're not marked, if it's a four-way intersection where there are sidewalks on both sides, or at least a public right-of-way on both sides, there is a crosswalk there. At a T-shaped intersection in Georgia, they don't interpret it as an unmarked area as having a crosswalk, but I think on Monroe, probably all of them, all the intersections are marked with crosswalks. That's a street where you need more than a crosswalk. I think the rapid flash beacons would be the best solution on Monroe. Yeah.
Let me be more blunt.
Yeah.
On both Monroe and Cherokee Avenue,
Right.
they have the marked things, they have the little signs, stop for pedestrians.
Right.
I mean, it's fairly well marked. In the issue of health disparities, they talk a lot about health issues related to environment and race and community.
Right.
And I go down those streets and I see all of that, every 2 blocks. I go down other parts of town and you can't even find one. So my question is there any research or data, or has the issue even come up about why these are in certain parts of town and not others?
Well, I think there are 2 reasons. One, in the post-World War, the developments that were created post-World War II, you're much less likely to have a street grid. And you're much more likely to have cul-de-sac neighborhoods where you have a T-shaped intersection that goes into an arterial street. Those don't have, the city's not willing to mark a crosswalk unless it is already a 4-way intersection. They're also, well, at least with the previous person who was in charge of transportation, they were very resistant to doing anything that cost money. They're still pretty bad about that because the city doesn't have a capital budget. So they were using all kinds of excuses, like if it's not already ADA compliant, then we're not going to mark a crosswalk or put in an in-street crosswalk sign. The other reason, I think, is that the people in Northeast Atlanta tend to be much more politically active. That's where most of PED's members are, and they know how to ask for these things. Fortunately, we have a tool on our website that enables people to ask for things like crosswalks or in-street crosswalk signs, and there's a link to it on the City of Atlanta's website under the how-to section, and that has really democratized these asks a lot. We're seeing from the grammar and spelling that these are a lot of people that probably don't live in Northeast Atlanta that are asking for improvements, asking for sidewalk repairs, things like that. But I think a lot of it is the Virginia Highlands, Grant Park, you have much more politically active people asking.
I would also suggest that perhaps, I don't know if this is true, but there are major parks there that have concerts and major events.
Yeah.
So whether that was a policy, that would be interesting to determine.
Yeah, but definitely the parts of the city that were designed and built prior to World War II are much more walkable, much higher frequency of intersections. And that's one of the things that people look at to see how walkable you are is the frequency of intersections. So going back through this. Now I want to talk about the characteristics of good sidewalk design. I mentioned that I'm not real keen on some of the stuff that's been done in Midtown. But these are the basics of what you want. You want it clear of obstacles. That's especially important for people with wheelchairs. Smooth surfaces really matter, level surfaces, having it wide enough. A buffer from the traffic here. On-street parking really helps. And basically going where you want. This is something that you occasionally see and you wonder, was this guy drunk? What is the point of having a meandering sidewalk like that? Unless maybe you're out in a wooded trail, but people like sidewalks to take them where they want to go with as few steps as possible. The issue of width really depends on where you are, how crowded it's going to be. In a neighborhood where you're rarely going to have more than 2 people at a time. 5 feet may be enough, but in a commercial area, you're going to need more. This is an example of one of the newer Midtown sidewalks. They seem to be more interested in making it look good to the drivers who are going by at 35 miles an hour than in actually making it walkable. But they have maintained a 5-foot buffer everywhere, even if it means the walking space is just 4 feet wide. And you can't walk side by side or have people comfortably walk in both directions. But they're basically keeping it to the ADA minimum. This is an area that's part of the Midtown Mile, where they're expecting lots and lots of pedestrians, but as you can see, people are being squeezed off the sidewalk already. Equal sides, this one's not in Midtown, but having just the landscaping also takes up a lot of the sidewalk, whereas if you put a grate over it, it really helps. This is that shelter that I can't stand right across the street from where I work, because you've got a furniture zone, but the shelter is in the part where you're supposed to be walking. So for somebody in a wheelchair, it's just an obstacle course. This is down in the Marietta Street. Why they put that clock where they did as opposed to in the furniture zone or back by the building, I don't know. So you see a lot of that. That's all difficult for older people, anybody with disabilities. Paving materials are another problem in Atlanta. We have spent way too much money on fancy pavers downtown by the Olympics. But we've got stuff like that. It's much more likely to fail in a short period of time than the 2 on the bottom are right near the Atlanta Regional Commission, than just a plain concrete sidewalk. These are in Midtown, and they've put the pavers on aggregate, which is a mixture of sand and other materials, and they're collapsing already, within a year or two. And unfortunately, we've got drivers who will, and I think that's a city vehicle, who just use the handicap ramps as though they're driveways and go right over the sidewalk. Downtown at the park, they had a problem that there's no matching pavers anymore with what they put in at Woodruff Park. So that doesn't look that great. So why spend all that money on granite sidewalks? Here's a case where downtown on Peachtree, the property owner is not willing to do it. It is his responsibility to pay for it, but finding all those different pavers and coming up with the money is difficult. It's especially important on curb ramps. Fortunately, we were able to get Midtown Alliance to change, or Midtown to change the zoning, but they had actually written into the zoning for their special public or SPI district that you had to use that kind of, I forget what that kind of granite at the bottom photo is called on the right, but that's not very good when you're in a wheelchair to have to go over that at the bottom of your curb ramp. Plain concrete is definitely easier to maintain. There's a company out in California, I think that they may be moving to Texas, but that makes rubber sidewalks. I think about 80 cities have experimented with that. Another issue is the crosswalk visibility. The longer markings, that was one of our first big achievements, was getting the state to change the guidelines for crosswalk markings from 2 parallel lines to ones that look more like a ladder, like this, except with the 2 parallel lines on it. Much more visible to the driver. Pedestrian can see that, but the driver can't. The staggered ladder that we have here really reduces maintenance costs, and that's how we were able to convince the engineers that they ought to switch, is that we said you'll have to replace it less often. This is a problem that we're starting to see. Midtown, also Decatur, I think, is making big mistakes investing in textured crosswalks. In theory, they're really visible. What, you like them?
Almost hit some up. They have those in Emory Village now.
Oh, really?
Not even see, I wasn't aware of a pedestrian.
Yeah. No, I hate these personally. You can see here the difference. Just even the 2 parallel lines in front are so much more visible than that next intersection that has the brick-colored crosswalk. And what happens is the landscape architects will show pictures like this to the business community and say, oh, won't this be pretty? but that's not what it's really going to look like on the ground. That's what a pedestrian sees, so they can see it's a crosswalk. The drivers are seeing this. The ones on Lindbergh are about the worst. You cannot see them until you're on top of them. And so you can see that we have really lost a lot in areas where we're putting these in. If there is a traffic signal, it's not so bad, but at a place that doesn't have a signal, I would always oppose these. In the rain, it's even worse. It was terrible after we had the snow and all that sand was going on them. At least putting white stripes can help. Do the ones out at Emory have the white stripes?
Not as bright as that.
Okay, I'll talk to them. And so this is Decatur before they put in the brick-colored ones. That's what you could see before. This is what you've got now, and there is a real issue of visibility. That was when they were brand new. They're also prone to failure much more than striping. This is Midtown, where they use stamped asphalt, and chunks of them are coming out. Yeah?
In this cost-conscious environment, why would anyone even think about tearing up the street and putting in these pavers all the way across when the paint?
That is a good question, and I think it's one of the biggest problems we have in transportation funding for pedestrians, in my opinion, is that the only people who have, or the only agencies that seem to have the 20% matching funds that is required to get federal funds are the community improvement districts, which is basically the business community. They care more about making it look pretty than they do about making it functional. And so all those pavers that we were seeing in Midtown Alliance pays 20%. It's self-taxing of the businesses. They pay 20%, and then they grab the 80% of federal money that this area is eligible for. Because the city of Atlanta doesn't have a capital fund, that basically it's the community improvement districts, they are more interested in making it look pretty. They're even planning now to make the downtown connector pretty for the people driving through to Florida. That's what they're investing in. And it's a big complaint for us. Yeah.
What do you think, Sally, what do you think of the one at Georgia State, Portland, and what is that, Decatur Street?
The one that has like their logo in it?
Yes.
It's better than these because
I think so, too.
it's got more white in it. And I'm going to show you a couple that are, if you're going to do something with the bricks, another thing, before I get there, this is hard on wheelchair users. Every brick is a bump. And that's one reason not to do it. We did convince Decatur. We didn't know until the week they were going to put these in. I don't know if this is Decatur or just one I got from someone else. It probably is somebody else. But we learned about it and got them to spend an additional $9,000 to change their plans and leave a smooth area. We pointed out that a lot of the disability agencies are in downtown Decatur, and that you need to leave at least 3 feet smooth in the center of these. That helps. Concrete is awful. The perimeter CID put concrete crossings in, and they learned their lesson. They realized they're invisible. Again, putting in the white lines, but that brings us back to where we were in the 90s with just the 2 parallel lines that are so much less visible from a distance. Here's an example of where you can make it visible, where you've got a mixture of white pavers and red pavers. But that it is a lot of money, and the question is that, given our transportation needs, that we have so many broken sidewalks, so many areas without safe crossings, why are we spending money just on looks? Other issues are the texture. When you put in a raised crosswalk, you definitely need texture to let people know, if they're visually impaired, that they're entering an area of danger, if they're entering the street. This is down in Serenbe, which is somewhat of a retirement community. They used cobblestones for their crosswalks, which is just ridiculous. The place to use texture is before you get to a crosswalk. So people might hear the bump, although you'd have to do it somewhat far enough back that people would notice. But you never want to use cobblestones on a crosswalk. And one of the arguments that I've made to Central Atlanta Progress and others is that people are much less interested in looking at their feet what the pavement is under their feet than at looking at pretty things at eye level. And so we do like the tile stuff that they put in Woodruff Park, but in other cities there's a lot more artwork on the walls, and we're trying to get them to spend less money on the pavers because it's not even a pleasant walking experience. Another big issue is that the people that work for the city don't know how to design, or they're not doing site-specific design, and they're building a lot of stuff that is worthless. Like the bottom left image, I put that tool that I have there is a smart level that gives me a digital readout, but I put it there mainly because it was 24 inches wide. A wheelchair is 30 inches wide at least, and so they created a ramp that is worthless, and they did it that way because there's a grate over there, and rather than do the site-specific design that would enable them to come up with something that actually works, they just squeezed it down to make it look like there was a ramp. The one at the top, wheelchair will turn over. They basically turned the whole sidewalk into a ramp. And the one on the upper right, you've got a lip at the bottom that's about 1.5 inches wide. I can't really see what the slope is at the one on the bottom, but I know most of the new ramps that have gone in Midtown do not have excessive slopes. There's one right by the MARTA station downtown, Peachtree Center Station, with a 14% slope when the maximum allowed is 8.3. Nobody's going to be able to get up that ramp in a wheelchair unless it's motorized. And then the final part of what I want to talk about is just the whole need for maintenance. This is another area where the Atlanta Regional Commission was very discriminatory. In its Plan 2040, I think that's recently adopted. Is it adopted, Carolyn?
Yes.
Plan for the next 25 years, they required all projects for motorists to include the cost of maintenance. They did not do that for pedestrian projects. They're not willing to invest in maintenance. We have, in the city of Atlanta, sidewalks that are in terrible condition. There have been an increasing number of huge settlements. In Sacramento, for the next 20 years after that settlement, or maybe it was the next 30 years, I think 20% of all their transportation money had to go into putting in curb ramps and repairing sidewalks. A university in the southwest Georgia was sued, and now this guy who had been looking for work just repairing sidewalks finally got some work because the university lost because they had no proactive program. Something similar happened in Atlanta. A woman sued the city. Her heel got caught in pavement. She sued the city, and it was over $1 million settlement. I learned from a friend that they're doing another lawsuit, a friend who's an attorney that's suing the city, a woman who's visually impaired right near the Vine City MARTA station. She fell on bad pavement. She's now paralyzed and is suing the city. If somebody, the person whose heel got caught, from what the attorney told me, one of the reasons it was such a high jury decision or jury award, over $1 million of it was pain and suffering, is they were trying to send the city a message, because when the attorney asked the city, how much do you budget each year for sidewalk and road maintenance, the answer was $300,000, and the jurors just gasped that for a city like Atlanta to spend only $300,000 a year on maintenance of roads and sidewalks. She can't wear heels anymore. That's her pain and suffering, and she's had a number of ankle surgeries. But the woman who's paralyzed, I would imagine she's going to get a lot more than $1 million. And the city really needs to learn that taxpayers would much rather have us spend money repairing the sidewalks than giving out awards to people who have been received major injuries.
Would you be able to talk about the Olmsted decision as well, or maybe Patrice could fill in on that too? But I just wanted to point that out because there's some people that we know of, say in the high-rises, that can't get out of their building because they literally get stuck on the sidewalk in their wheelchairs. The get rocks kind of embedded in their chair.
When was that decision?
Well, that was.
That was a long time ago.
A long time ago, but the reason I mention it is because it's come up in this recent FTA grant announcement of $30 million across the country for veterans, primarily for greater accessibility in the community, transportation, call centers, mobility access, etc. But it goes back to the Olmsted decision, where people should be allowed to live in their communities, and it's
Okay.
the onus is on us to provide that accessibility, that they accessible housing, access to services, that they can live in the community. They don't have to go to a nursing home because they can't get out of their house because the sidewalks are bad repaired. So
Well, that does sound really relevant. I'm not real knowledgeable about it.
And I think a lot of what the Olmsted decision was exactly that, looking at, someone going to a long-term care facility versus going, having services, and that would be appropriate for persons of all ages.
exactly right.
This is what a lot of cities are doing now. City of Atlanta has created it. We think the system that we have created for reporting hazards works better, primarily because in Atlanta you often have to follow up and follow up and follow up. And when people report the pedestrian hazards, they get a message back about who it's going to and how to follow up. And then people can also come back to our website and indicate whether or not things have been resolved. Not that many people are doing that, and so we had hoped to be able to compare the different jurisdictions in the region in terms of how well they're following up. But we are actually just noticing on the things that aren't getting addressed, like sidewalk repairs. We've met with the City of Atlanta staff members to say, well, what happens when somebody reports a broken sidewalk? What do you do? What we learned is that they will send a notice to the property owner that it's their responsibility to pay for repairs. If you send us a check, we'll fix it. But if nobody sends a check, nothing else happens. And we met recently with the Public Works Commissioner and learned that one of the big problems is that if you do send them a check, it goes into the general fund. It's not going to Public Works. And so they're not expanding their budget, even if the property owner does pay. And this was something by Donald Shoup. He thinks maybe it's because the sidewalks are failing gradually, that they're being neglected. I don't think that's true. I just think it's this system of the property owner pays is so unacceptable to property owners, especially in a city with a high poverty rate, and where this was his survey of a lot of cities, that the property owner in about 40% pays the full cost, which is what it is in Atlanta. More cities do it where it's like half and half, or at least the city pays a fourth to give you an incentive. An increasing number of cities are now paying the full cost because they realize that where you've got systems like we have in Atlanta, basically everything gets neglected. PEDS thinks that it's really unfair to delegate it to the property owner. It's treating sidewalks as second class, that we don't pay for the street repairs except through our taxes. This is actually the sidewalk adjacent to my house. I don't feel too good about fixing my sidewalk if I know that Georgia Power and others can continue to park on it. Here's some other city vehicles, city or MARTA, all of them, and Georgia Power. But we have seen so many city vehicles parked on the sidewalks, even brand new ones. But the main people that it's unfair to is the pedestrians, that I would fix mine if I felt that my neighbors would fix theirs, so that we could have a system where you can actually walk on the sidewalks. But fixing one sidewalk, if the others are just as bad, isn't going to get the runners back on the, or the people pushing strollers back on the sidewalks. It needs to be done in a more systematic way. It's also greatly increasing the costs. If every person is bringing in their own cement truck, it's much more expensive. And this company, it's called Safe Sidewalks of Georgia, or Georgia Safe Sidewalks, they won't do that kind of thing on a piecemeal basis with property owners. If you're a property owner, you basically replace your sidewalk. If the city hired somebody like that to deal with these tripping hazards, and it was just something like that that got that woman by the MARTA station to fall, who's now paralyzed. It was just a 1-inch tripping hazard. And those are the kind of things that probably for $50 the city could repair. And instead it's probably going to have a multi-million-dollar jury decision. In 2007, the city thought there was 25% that needed to be replaced or repaired. Estimated the cost at $80 million. But they admitted, we really don't know how big the problem is. They had only surveyed commercial areas where they're not nearly as bad. But they have no surveys. More recently, they've basically doubled the estimate. They're now saying it's $152 million backlog on the sidewalks and a $26 million backlog on the curb ramps. So we have incredibly old infrastructure. And if this whole system of the property owner pays, they collected $200,000 in 4 years. That's a 3,000-year backlog. And again, this guy's just saying, this is the basic problem. The cities aren't budgeting for sidewalk maintenance. The Atlanta Regional Commission wasn't insisting that they budget for it. And they're allowing groups like the Midtown Alliance to put in sidewalks that are going to need maintenance very, very soon. So this is what I wanted to end on, is basically to start a discussion on this. How can we make the safe, convenient pedestrian facilities a higher priority for our region? So I think those of you at the ARC might be the best ones to tell us. I think we need to get the aging division really more engaged in the decision making in the transportation division. They have talked about incorporating it, but I don't really see it happening.
Mm-hmm. We've had individuals from the local photography club, from the senior center, and the Mapleton Improvement Coalition come together. We used Safe Routes to School evaluation,
Mm-hmm.
and went around the community and identified what the needs were and how walkable it was. And we found out it wasn't terribly walkable, and it isn't. So it gives us something to refer back to,
Mm-hmm.
to find out, where our destinations, where are people walking, where are the challenges, where are the crosswalks. And so with all the projects that we've done to date, where we're looking at the walkability and pedestrian access, we're able to go back to that document and say, hey, it's just not doable, or this
Mm-hmm.
is what we found. It's just given us something to hang our hat on.
Mm-hmm.
It's one small area,
Mm-hmm.
but I think just having that basis, that data at the beginning is a first step for us.
So just gathering all the data.
Yeah.
And was this volunteers that were gathering? Because it was interesting, we recommended to the City of Atlanta that we engage volunteers in all the communities, all the neighborhoods, to gather that data, and they said, well, we wouldn't give it any credibility because people are going to exaggerate how bad things are in their own neighborhood. And so it's partly just the attitude of the city government. And now, the deputy commissioner of Public Works, who was in charge of transportation, she got fired last year, so maybe it won't be as bad anymore. She was so bad that when we would recommend things like the in-street crosswalk signs or the speed radar signs that say how fast people are going, she would say things like, well, what if it works? Then everybody's going to want one. And so her main goal was to limit the work that her department had to do. Now that she's gone, we might have a better chance. And I know that the transportation planner with the city, he has asked for help really in terms of how can we inventory? What's the best way to even do an inventory of, because you saw in a couple of those slides, they don't know how many miles of sidewalk they have. They really don't know the condition. The fact that the sampling they did was just in commercial areas makes their sampling so unreliable because it's in the neighborhoods that they're particularly bad. Yeah.
I think a couple of things you hinted at are drivers of this, and one is the paratransit cost. So,
Mhm.
we've tried to explain, or given, we say the TIA, Transportation Improvement Act, where we do now have, a great amount of funds that go towards transit projects.
Mhm.
However, they have to keep in mind that every time there's a transit, well, I think there'll be some federal money involved in any of these transit projects.
Right.
Anytime it's mixed in the pot, the federal requirements kick in, and that would be ADA, the 3/4 mile on either side of a transit fixed route. You've got to have paratransit. So point being is, if you don't have those areas walkable, and for people to access fixed route, they're going to be calling on paratransit, and that increases the cost of that transit, service. So we're trying to instill that in people's minds that every time you're going to have a transit project, you've got to have the paratransit that goes along with that. But to reduce the cost, you've got to make this accessible for people to access fixed route.
Right.
So that's kind of a driver, but not just so much the TIA projects, but just overall any transit fixed route we have now. And that's why, for example, Cobb County Transit, I even will say that bottom line is they had to cut 3 fixed routes in Cobb County because literally paratransit was so if they didn't have paratransit costs, they could sustain fixed route. That's what I'm trying to say.
That's something
Everything
that.
had to go because paratransit was too expensive.
Do you have any documentation of that?
Yes.
Because that's the kind of thing that PEDS needs to be really publicizing, because most people thought that Cobb cut those lines because they're basically trying to get low-income people out of their county. But that, that's
They didn't pick the routes that were less used
right.
of any of the routes.
Right.
But still, it impacted over 200 paratransit users.
Oh wow.
That now they have to find a way to use. In fact, another example is when they cut MARTA some of their stops and routes. Those older adults and those using fixed route then could no longer walk to the next stop, and they had to use paratransit, which ironically increased MARTA's cost.
Right.
So,
And that's the kind of information that can really help us is being able to make.
getting at the economics of it.
Yeah, no, because that's the kind of thing we can share with Ariel Hart, a reporter with AJC, who would not be aware of that. And I think that is powerful. And that's why I was thinking that in terms of the whole issue of safe crossings, getting some people with disabilities, older people who can't walk very far out there, and showing how they can't walk to the next bus stop, and getting an estimate of what that would add to CCT's costs if they were to remove these bus stops, because I do think it would add more costs than putting in a crossing.
I think the civil rights is a good way to go, with that as well. And I think, I won't quote this, but I believe with our Plan 2040, we do have minimum standards and excellent standards. And the excellent standards gets communities and higher up in the list for funds that if they achieve excellent standards, and I know that pedestrian access, et cetera, would be in the excellent standards, if not minimum, minimum. But it gets them in the higher queue for funding that comes down to the state, because it is the Department of Community Affairs requirement for those standards.
Okay, good. Yeah.
And I just want to give kind of an overview, because you mentioned about response from the aging division of ARC, and I think many of you probably are aware that how long has it been, maybe 5 years now, that we've had the lifelong, actually a little longer than that, a lifelong communities initiative, and I think we have moved away from just the delivery of services to really looking at lifelong community approaches, and bringing on in our own aging division someone like Carolyn, who has a planning background, which we never had before, and Cheryl, who's working with local communities on a much different level. It's a new approach that our aging division has really gone into, so we're getting there.
Good. Yeah.
Is PEDS tied into the Beltline project at all? Are you supportive of that? Is that conflicts with you? Because it does meander a little, so that.
It isn't where I would put, it wouldn't be a top priority for me for where I would put transit. I think having a trail like that for recreational uses and also for connecting some areas is great. I would much rather have transit on streets like Ponce and 10th Street. They have changed changed the plan some so that the circle will also have east-west connecting streets, which I think will make it much more likely that it will be used. But the city is really underparked, and that's an important thing. I'm involved on some of their committees. I've been involved on the Technical Advisory Committee and also on the Accessibility Committee, because one of the big issues with that trail is that it's way above the grade or way below the grade of regular streets, and so you're going to need huge ramps to enable people to get onto it. And so with limited funding at the beginning, there's not going to be very many access points. And so I think the Beltline is a good project. I'm sorry to see so much of the city's resources going into such a small amount of space. And I also think by saying that they're putting transit on it, it really inflated land values, which it pretty much forces developers to have much higher density than is probably appropriate in those areas, that the best places to put density is on streets that are adjacent to the north-south or east-west transit lines where you're getting a direct route where you're trying to go instead of going in a circle. Having been a transit user, most of my life, my adult life anyway, I know that transfers are the biggest thing to discourage you from using transit. That I'm close to the Art Center station, and so I mainly have to go downtown or Buckhead, and it's very easy. I had a staff member who worked in Decatur, and when our office was downtown, he took transit every day. When we moved to Midtown and he had to transfer, he started driving to work. And so I do know that with the Beltline, people having to transfer, get off, change possibly to the east-west line, and then change to the north-south, they're going to be driving. So I do worry about that. But, we're supportive. I would have spread out the resources more in the city. Yeah.
I just want to comment, we talked earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the root cause, and this is not something we can fix today, but it's just this incredible reliance and almost obsession with the automobile as the sole means of appropriate travel. And that means that if you're walking or running or riding a bicycle, you're somehow intruding on the appropriate use of this public space. You get that kind of attitude. People in the cars in Atlanta, so fast, traffic congestion, all those kind of things. Beyond even other cities, America's bad enough, but you go to Boston, Denver, Seattle, Portland, there really is kind of a more enlightened perspective that the streets are public spaces.
Well, I think that's really the big issue. The Project for Public Places is a fantastic group. They this week came out with an article just talking about it's the obsession with mobility. I mean, we've had plans, I think, at ARC, Mobility 2030 was one of them, and Keep Georgia Mobile, or Keep Georgia Moving. It's this idea that, and it's a mistaken idea, that the goal of transportation is to increase mobility. The goal of transportation is to enable people to get to destinations. But what this Project for Public Places article talked about is that this obsession with fast movement has made our destinations places you don't even want to go to, and that even moving through them is unpleasant. And that's where I bring up again what Midtown Alliance and Central Atlanta Progress are talking about doing is let's decorate the downtown connector so that it's a more pleasant experience for the people moving through. To me, that is a really misguided use of our resources. But the goal really the whole purpose you create a city is to minimize the need for movement, to get your destinations closer to where you live, to really maximize your ability to meet with people, to do things without having to move much. And so this obsession with movement, and ARC is really at fault for this one, is that they are favoring long-distance travel over short-distance travel. That, for example, they have said with this regional thoroughfare program they started in the past year, is that the roads that people use for at least 20 miles are going to be the ones that are favored for our transportation money. That is sick, because we should be favoring the areas, and especially the people who choose to put less strain on our resources, less damage to the environment, that promote public health by making it possible to live in a lifelong community. The people who can get their groceries, do their shopping, go home, walk to work, whatever, they should be the ones who are really being favored.
And I'm interested, Cheryl, with the work she's done in Lifelong Mableton. One of the biggest accomplishments has been adoption of a form-based code for Mableton, where you can do live, work, play kind of development within this area. It doesn't have to be commercial here, housing here, all separated uses. So that's going to be really exciting.
That's great. That's great. And I think what we really need to do is help ARC and the Georgia DOT understand that the goal of transportation is accessibility, that it's to get people to destinations. Movement is one way of doing it, but creating these form-based codes, street grids that make it easy to access your destinations, places that are pleasant where people would want to live in a small city or wherever, where there's the mix of uses. That transportation is one movement is one means to access your goods. But short distance movement, like being able to cross the street, is also very important. But that is really being ignored in how the state and the region are spending our federal money.